Hello and welcome. Next up, we are in conversation with Victor Dlamini and Mike Stopforth, talking about their brand new business. It's called 48 Hours, and of course, they are legends in their own right. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, just talking about what they've been up to and their social media crisis consultancy. So, Victor, it's good to see you, and Mike, it's good to see you too.
Good to see you.
How are you guys doing? How have you been with COVID-19? It's extraordinary. We were talking as we were setting up how the world has so dramatically changed for everyone.
Well, I think, Aki, you and I have known each other for many years. I remember when I started doing serious communications, I would walk from my house in Morningside to 702 at that time. When you were still there with Yusuf, and I was doing elections work.
Yes.
And there was a certain intimacy in radio. There was a certain love. There were callers that you knew will call. Then I think radio went through the doldrums, and we lost that intimacy. I think if COVID has done one thing, because it's retreated all of us back to our houses, we've kind of rediscovered, largely through the more familiar forms like podcasting and all that. So no longer is radio and our experience of it, or let's not call it radio anymore, media. There is a certain intimacy that one has discovered by being there at home on your own. And interestingly enough, that's the one thing that I've found, that, I've had the time to subscribe to the things that I like. And obviously, one of the biggest changes is that data in South Africa is still expensive.
Yes.
But it's considerably cheaper than it used to be. So if there's one thing I've done, I've just binged on content. And I think in many ways, because people had so much time, it's also, I think, highlighted the crisis that can happen in social media, because people are spending so much time on their devices. And I think for us, this was both a period of great uncertainty, but it also clarified a number of things in our minds.
Absolutely. And you're still very much delving into your art collection and photography and that, because Victor is not only like way better dressed than Mike and I in terms of style. We bow down to Victor, but still very much in the art world, collecting authentic pieces of art and creating your own art and photography. I mean, that runs through your DNA.
Well, Aki, it's very interesting. If you look at the importance of Africa in terms of content.
Yes.
So if you look at Netflix as an example, Netflix, Europe, America is saturated. Where do you think their focus is right now? It's on South America, it's on Africa, and it's on Asia. So my sense is that with art, we think of the Picassos, the Van Goghs and all that. In the next 50 years, the most important art is going to come from South Africa. You can already see, whether you are looking at the work of Gerard Sikot or William Kentridge, Sam Tlengetwa, the most important collectors are insisting on it. My own journey started in 2002 when I bought my first piece of art, and I've never stopped. And I think I was ahead of the curve. It's lovely now to see how so many other people understand both the joy of collecting art, but also it's important as an actual investment asset class.
Oh, amazing. And Mike, you and I go back a long way as well. I mean, you are probably the guy that I respect the most when it comes to social media, understanding what it could be, even in the days when people were trying to understand what the word social media means. You've had an interesting journey. I mean, you've run many digital agencies, and here we are with 48 Hours. But take us back to where it started, and how's COVID been for you? Has it been a journey of reimagination? Has it kind of forced you to rethink things?
Yeah, well, actually, I think we go back a lot further than you realize, because I remember listening to you giving traffic updates in the car with my mom when I was in high school. So, we go back quite a long way.
You see what he's doing, Victor? Makes me look old.
It was just at that stage,
instantly.
it was a very one-way relationship.
Okay.
You weren't really reciprocating as I hoped. But yeah, it's funny. The more things change, the more they stay the same. In some respects, very little has changed over the last 15 years. We're still getting used to a new way of connecting and communicating, and the accelerated rate of change that comes with technological disruption. And just before this, we were talking about TikTok, and we're supposed to be experts in this field, and yet when we look at these new tools, we feel a little out of our depth, because there's a language and a culture that is, I guess, in many ways new to all of us.
Yeah.
COVID has been, I think, an accelerant. And I said this on an interview yesterday, and I'm wary, of course, that I'm saying this from the perspective of somebody who enjoys a fair amount of privilege and security, and obviously we were able to take a little bit of a break as a family and spend more time together. And I mean, everybody's happy and healthy, so thank goodness, and touch wood, everybody's okay. I know that it's been a very different story for many other people, but it's accelerated a couple of things. Number one is our focus as a family, and I guess Anna and I, on the basics. What do we care about the most? What do we enjoy spending our time on the most? How do we create value together? And I don't think that's just unique to us. I think a lot of businesses are thinking about the basics. I think a lot of people who are inventing new solutions are going, how can we disrupt industries, but at the basics? How can we do the small things a lot better? Because what we've realized is a lot of the fluff is unnecessary. A lot of what we considered to be important before maybe is less important than we thought it was. But yeah, I left Cerebra, which was just the most amazing journey at the end of 2018. Took a year off to study. Thankfully, did that in 2019 and not in 2020. Obviously, I had foresight about that.
Now he tells us.
Hindsight is 2020 vision, right? And then I had aspirations to start up a number of projects in 2020, and for obvious reasons took a bit of a break. This was one of the things that I'd explored for a long time. As much as social media has now matured into a semi-mature channel for brands and for their consumers, there still seems to be, and maybe even increasingly so, this repetition of mistakes by brands who seem to read the situation really badly.
Well, listen, that's a great segue to what we want to talk about, because, I mean, you guys have set up this incredible company, social media crisis consultancy. Firstly, how did 48 Hours come about? You were talking about it was something that was bubbling there, and then how did the marriage happen? And tell us a little bit about 48 Hours and what is it that you guys exactly do?
So in 2004, I first met Mike through a mutual friend, Tebe Kalafeng. And
another well-dressed man.
Yeah, we used to meet out in Bryanston, of all places, and for some reason we kept up our contact. I thought he was exceedingly bright. You're
talking about Mike?
Yeah, he was 20. he was 24 at the time, and I was quite surprised by his industry. And I will see his writings, where he would often write about technology. What struck me was how he was able to take private interest and extrapolate it onto enterprise level implications.
Okay.
So from day one, I thought, gee, this is a very smart young man. And then we created a bond over the years. So one of the things that I think we're always surprised by is how, remember there was a time where serious CEOs were very proud of not being online, but particularly on things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. It was almost a sign of how much time they had for their real business. And I think that the underinvestment in social media that has created so much crisis is because a lot of it had been outsourced to the marketing and communications department, and I think it's a grave mistake. So part of what has created our companies, we say it with Mike, for as long as corporate South Africa and the corporate environment in general underestimate the number of eyeballs, the attention. Basically, these things are like a catalyst. They drive conversations. And when you get it wrong there, your loyal base that you disappoint, it's almost like your touch point.
Yes.
What your call center was 20 years ago, your social media, that's what it is now. So that's why we thought it deserved our attention.
Yeah, I think Victor's been very kind to me. Thanks again, Vic. You always, I need to just have you around permanently. It's like the person who reads my bio. You're always very generous. But being a doyen of the industry himself, Victor has this unique ability to recalibrate the assumptions that traditional media and traditional communication specialists have had about that role over the years. And the shift is simple. The shift has been from broadcast to conversation.
Yeah.
But what that actually means in practice is far more complicated and far more nuanced than I think most brands have been willing to acknowledge or embrace. Some of them have done so with aplomb and have almost naturally become conversational organizations, have demonstrated that that was probably part of their culture and part of the way that they communicated with their staff and stakeholders already. Others have really struggled and don't quite yet understand, even after 15 years of doing this, that they are guests in social media. Social media is not an auditorium with a loudspeaker at the front that you get to walk up to, stand on the stage and speak. It is a it's a cocktail dinner.
Yes.
And you walk in there and you suss out the room and you figure out what the vibe is and you dress appropriately and you fit in and you do your best to network. And as any of you who have any degree of social anxiety, which I do, you don't, you work a room like a boss. But like if you walk into a cocktail party, it's hard work.
Yes.
You've got to apply yourself. You've got to pay attention. You've got to immerse yourself in the conversation. You've got to connect yourself to what other people are saying. How many brands really do that in this space? And I partly blame social media because it's become very much advertising and broadcast oriented by virtue of its business model. But the DNA of the thing hasn't changed.
Okay.
The substance of the thing hasn't changed.
So social media crisis consultancy, in 48 hours, is that the time that it takes for something to, for all hell to break loose? Or is that how much time you have to sort something out before all hell breaks loose?
So I think let's go back to perhaps the most important word, which is crisis.
Yes.
So
define crisis for me. What is a social media crisis?
Basically, crisis is when anything is no longer in the control of that organization. So organizations are used to pay for advertising where they control. So if they launch a car, for example, they will tell you that this car, these are the features it's got, and all that, and it's typically one way. So if you think of a great double page spread on a Sunday newspaper, you're sitting there, you're looking at this thing and saying, wow, this is marvelous, I want it. Or even if it's on television, on radio, there's beautiful sound and beautiful visuals. Now, in social media, you might make all those claims and someone says, actually, I took this car for a spin yesterday and it didn't do these two things. I think you've seen it with self-drive cars where a manufacturer makes the claims and then someone shows us a video of something going wrong. So crisis is that point when the claims of a brand or an institution are being tested by a user or a set of users, and they are unable to respond quickly and convincingly enough, and the conversation goes out of their control. It could be any number of things. It could be something that has that has happened to someone, and they relate their story. And so typically what happens is that they'll try a number of things. The classic one is that they'll just ignore it.
Worst thing to do, eh?
Yeah, hoping that it goes away. So that's where we come in with Mike. We realize that a lot of the organizations just don't have the internal antennas to kind of, as Mike says, it's a conversation. So if you are used to broadcasting, just dumping stuff there, unidirectional, your ears are poorly trained. You don't have the analytic tools. So and as you say, 48 hours. Why? Because if you have not got on top of that issue in 24 hours, you go from crisis to disaster.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, yeah, 48 hours is a long time. I guess that's a great definition of a crisis. I like what you said, dude. You don't have any control. But I guess the word social media might be a bit misleading, because ultimately in today's world, a crisis will spill over onto social media. So it doesn't necessarily have to start on social media.
No, that's 100% true, Aki. I just want to reiterate or expand on one of the points that Victor made, because I think it feeds into what I'm about to respond to that question. The best way to avoid a crisis as a brand is to promise to be terrible. If you tell people you'll give them terrible service, you'll never have a crisis, because their expectations will almost always be met. The problem that many traditional marketers have with dealing with the dynamics that social media presents to them is they don't understand that the essence, the source of all of their pain is the gap between what they promise and what they can realistically deliver in reality.
Right.
If I'm expecting 10 out of 10 from a brand and I get 3 out of 10, I'm going to be devastated.
Yes.
But the same applies if I'm expecting 3 out of 10 and I get 4 out of 10, then I'm not all that upset, right? In fact, I'm going to be thrilled.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you exceeded my expectations. So I think this dynamic is quite important for us to understand. This is a function of our own creating as organizations. We have worked for years, decades, in fact, employing agencies, employing our own marketers to create a facade, a lipstick on the pig, if you like,
yes,
that we're surprised when people kind of see through it. So why does social media matter so much? I think for this very reason, is because it gives the ordinary person, for the first time ever, the ability to publish, right?
Right.
If Gutenberg's printing press made the illiterate literate, then Zuckerberg's Facebook made the unpublished published. And that dynamic, this idea that anybody can be a publisher, anybody can exert influence, anybody can build a network, anybody can have a published opinion, is a very double-edged sword, as we've realized over the years. We've got this plague of fake news and misinformation that's a very real concern for us. But also, on the flip side of that, we have the really positive leveling of the power dynamic between brands and their consumers. So why do crises spill into social media? Well, because I guess news sites and journalists and media gatekeepers have become more and more reliant on social media as a source of both information or news. I use that term very.
Look at Donald Trump.
Yeah, they use it as news, but they also use it as a way to market their own news in order to get as quick and as visceral a response as possible. After all, that sells more clicks, and that keeps advertisers happier. It's part of a very dysfunctional system, as we know. But social media is also the place that people choose to exist in. They partly identify in it. A lot of people's personalities are partly digital, partly real world. They almost have this kind of amalgamated bionic existence where I'm partly who I am on Twitter and partly who I am in reality. So there's a lot of personal power and leverage in that space. And so things often spill over there, because if I don't get a response using traditional methods, and I still don't get a response when I phone the call center, and I still don't get a response when I email, but I'm most angry, I choose the most damaging platform to reach out to you. And you know what's really sad and really concerning is that brands reward that behavior better than they do my responsible behavior that came before.
That's frightening.
If it takes me 45 minutes to get an answer on a call center, but 4 minutes to get an answer on Facebook, guess where I'm going to complain?
Exactly. And you're 100% right. So would you say that you guys are almost like firemen, and you take a fire truck to
SWAT
a
team.
crisis,
Yeah.
or a SWAT team? I don't know. Is that a fair description on how to describe yourselves?
Well, I think to a certain extent, yes, because when there's a fire,
And it's raging in the building. It starts on the first floor, and then it goes right up to the 20th floor. And it's out of control.
Yeah, basically what you want is the people who've got the tools, who are calm, who know how to scale the various floors and do so safely. So essentially, what we bring is a very reliable toolkit, which is, interestingly enough, as Mike and I keep on saying to people, it's largely cultural. rather than it's, yes, skill is important, but it's also the culture. How do you, because the first thing you have to do is come there, be as calm as possible, look at the thing. So very often the one thing that brands do is they are sometimes more defensive than they need to be. Because sometimes all it takes is to acknowledge that you've actually made a mistake.
Yes.
So one of the things that we've also noticed is the problem with the apology. Is that if you think about it, there is nothing quicker to fix a problem than just apologizing. But what happens if you haven't fixed the problem? So one of the things that we see so often is delayed flights on, someone has got a very important meeting, or they've got a link up flight, and great airline that is always on social media, very funny, they've got great ads, great experience on board. Suddenly they are not telling people why 4 hours later the flight has not taken off, and people have missed connections and all that. And it becomes a problem because people will say, but then they post, they say, gee, this is just so lousy. Why is no one telling me what's going on? And so the quickest thing is to apologize. But what happens when it happens the next day and the week after that and the week after that? So part of the thing is we always advise these people that yes, communications is important, but ultimately what's the real fix is to change the customer experience. That's the real fix, so that they don't have anything to complain about.
And customer experience is key in the world that we're living in today. I mean, you guys have raised so many examples of customer experience, that could go horribly wrong and could be so damaging. Are you guys firemen? I mean, describe for me how does 48 hours fit into a crisis?
Yeah, so I mean, having both worked in the traditional,
eye of the storm, yeah.
Sure, I'll do my best. We can create a crisis right now if you want. We can do it in practice.
I don't trust you guys.
Surprise! Check your Twitter. So I think we've both had extensive experience in the traditional agency world, and while there is absolutely, I would never knock the traditional agency model, and I ran an agency for a very long time, and I loved it. And there are people in that space who can provide reputation management services. We realized there was a gap around two things. Number one is that the traditional agency model typically works on a billable hours or retainer-based service, which means that, number one, it's quite difficult to correlate spend from a client perspective with the actual service that you're getting, and that needs to be managed quite carefully. It's not impossible to do, but we thought that it would be really powerful to be able to provide the client with a service where they absolutely know in the moment they're getting what they're paying for, right? So we're not working on a kind of annuity-based, we're working on you pay for us when you need us. Okay. Like a doctor's house call kind of thing. Okay. I don't want my doctor on retainer.
And you've got that toolkit, as Victor says, that you come in with a special tool set.
So that's the second part, is that it's extremely high touch and you're dealing with Victor and I, or Victor or I. The reason we do that is because, we didn't necessarily see a gap or opportunity to grow a massive agency that scaled into multiple levels. I think we love doing this work. I mean, Victor and I it's weird, we probably need more hobbies, but we would discuss informally before we ever thought about formalizing this as a business, what was going on in a crisis. And we would share notes and we would chat about it, and we would hop on the phone and go, did you see what XXX has done? And so I think we both really enjoy immersing ourselves in this space because I think we're very interested in how communities and how brands and how the custodians of those brands respond. But we specifically wanted to create a solution that fit into the gap that exists right now. If I'm contracted to a client and I've posted content that has gone pear-shaped on Twitter, how am I supposed to advise that client about what to do? I'm not complicit, but it's difficult for me to remain objective in that situation. So what clients often want is extremely objective, extremely practical, high-level expertise in the moment that they need it. Nobody else can provide that, and that's where we saw the opportunity.
Yeah, and I think, Aki, perhaps the thing about it is if you think about it, in the first phase of social media growth, community management was really the key.
Yes.
You know, the people wanted presence. You know, now presence is ubiquitous. Everyone is there, but you can see. I mean, you can almost see the social media presence that dies on the weekend. You know, like people are not there, which is quite interesting, especially now that a lot of the marketers work from home. So it's interesting that you can almost see that they are not there. But there's also something else. There's a lot of automation, and as we've seen, sometimes there's supposed to be an event. That event gets cancelled, but the automated post doesn't know that. It still goes. It still goes off. So I think part of our more advisory work is just to say to our clients that social media has changed a lot, and what we are also finding, and I think you will have noticed that sometimes the CEO or the leader of that organization is a superstar on social media, and they outflank their organization. So as a result, it's always interesting when you've got a superstar CEO or shareholder who's got lots of opinions about how things could be run efficiently. And yet people are saying, but my debit order, I have an illegal debit order that's coming, and they direct it to the CEO, who then now directs them either to an automated or the bot or something else. So I think sometimes, and Mike said this earlier on, if you promise so much, people take you at your word, and I think that's something that we are seeing right now as a kind of secondary crisis, as social media has matured to that extent that people have really been able to build their own reputations, identities, and yet I don't think they've done a proper audit between how they may have left their own organizations behind, and it creates a crisis of its own, because you are now dealing with an experience, but your expectations are so high. So
that's so interesting.
In our more advisory work, that's what we're always saying to them. We're saying, look at the alignment between your senior people, the kind of noise you make online, and the kind of disappointments that you unleash on your customers.
Well, it's an interesting point, because, I mean, you raised this earlier as well at the beginning of the conversation, and I remember a few years ago, you and I had a conversation, and you were of the opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you encourage CEOs to be on social networks like Twitter, for example, to talk to people. And I guess the way social media has evolved, do you still encourage CEOs to be on Twitter? Because there are certain CEOs. Okay, good. Certain CEOs get it right.
Yeah.
And then certain CEOs get it horribly wrong. I mean, if you had Donald Trump as your CEO, your company would be in big trouble, right?
Yeah. So what I would say to clients is they would approach us and go, look, hey, Michael, you're Don's on Twitter, and this is amazing. Look how good it is for the F&B brand. Can you put our CEO on Twitter? And I'd be like, no. Is he or she on Twitter, first of all? And they'd be like, no. So I say, let's not do that, right? Because the insincerity or the disingenuity of doing that is going to be picked up immediately. It's going to be visceral, right? Yes. But not being on the platform is not an excuse for not caring about the impact of the platform on your customers or your staff. That's inexcusable. You don't have to be on Twitter or TikTok or anything, but you sure as hell need to know what these things mean for your organization. I just want to add to what Victor was saying earlier, because I think this is a point that we actually haven't mentioned to you yet, but we're one of the few clients, I guess, service providers that would ever say to a client, we sincerely hope we never have to work with you. In fact, I finished off a phone call with a
I really hope we don't have to see you.
I really hope we never speak. And I mean that, because when crises happen, it's tough. I use the analogy, it's like having your kid kicked. It's like watching your kid playing football on a football pitch at school.
I know that feeling. I remember watching my daughter playing hockey in grade 1. She got smacked on the head, and it was just like blood all over the place, and I had to rush her to hospital. So I can relate.
It's very difficult to be rational in that situation,
completely.
right? All your sense and reason goes out the window, and you want to...
I ran straight onto the field, picked her up, and took her to hospital, which I shouldn't have done.
Did you swing a hockey stick at the other kid, though?
I was tempted to, but
okay, because sometimes brands do that as well. But the point being is that in those moments, we, as Victor said, we get very defensive, we get very emotional. I would prefer, given the opportunity, to prevent that from ever happening. So a lot of the work that we are seeking to do with clients is preventative work.
Yes.
So let's scenario plan. Let's imagine the worst, because this is another thing that blows my mind, is that there are very few crises that happen to brands that they couldn't have anticipated. You know, there's 2.5 months before the crisis happened, there was probably a meeting where somebody said, are we sure we're okay with this? You know, does anybody think this? Yeah, we'll be fine. And then, 2.5 months later, board level disaster, and please get the experts in. I think that there's so much of an opportunity for us to do preventative work, educational work, to equip clients for anticipating, preempting, preparing, empowering stakeholders, rather than panicking and having to call the SWAT team in to mitigate damage.
Have a fire extinguisher.
Yeah,
or
insulate the cabling.
Have a smoke detector. But, guys, you speak, and as you were talking, I was thinking about several crises that I've seen unfold over the last few months. Can you share some recent examples of crises that have gone horribly wrong? And we're not criticizing brands. And I think back to Clicks, for example, and how that unfolded, and if things could have been done different. I think of data breaches by some of the banks. So everyone is going to deal with a crisis at some point in their life. So you need to know how to deal with it. You need to get the A squad in to help you deal with it. But what kind of crises have you guys seen? Can you share some examples of what we're talking about? And I guess it's quite difficult to quantify the reputational damage that a crisis can have, because you also have to recover from that as well. But let's talk about some crises that you guys have seen.
Well, I think one that's personally, I'm surprised by how long it's gone on. And it's a CEO that you've mentioned. So if you look at Rain, for example, the data provider, they came with great online collateral, great social media. They were everywhere. They promised a 5G experience for people, and with Michael Jordan being one of their founders. And I'm surprised at how badly they have addressed the dissatisfaction of their customers online. They've not been responsive in a way that, given the natural abilities on social media, with it, that you would have expected from those guys. So for me, it's one that I see, and I think it just seems there's a surprising indifference to the pain that the customers are experiencing.
And it's so interesting you talk about that brand, because I hear exactly the same things from people. And coming back to what Mike was saying earlier, when your initial experience was an amazing one, when you actually get the delivery of the service and the devices, that's pretty well handled. You do it online, it's executed well, but the second part which you talk about isn't executed as well. And I guess that's where that expectation things come in. But it's an interesting example. What have you seen crises, interesting ones that you can share with us, Mike?
Yeah, so we've had the opportunity to work with 3 or 4 brands since we fired up at the end of last year, but significant projects, and then obviously there've been a number of other queries where, quite honestly, we've said to the client, either we don't necessarily need to consult, we can just advise you. I worked with a school the other day. I don't feel comfortable charging the school, but it's great to be able to give them advice in that situation. Confidence is of the utmost, it's imperative to us, right? Yeah. And so we typically wouldn't talk about the clients that we've done work with, but let's use an example that you've mentioned. Let's use the Clicks example, because I think it's the last good example of a massive crisis that is almost a national level event, right? Yeah. But I think it's a good example of how so many organizations, so many brands that are a big part of our daily lives and a big part of our conversation, a big part of our social construct even often, are incredibly complex businesses. You know, the
Yes.
brand is a simple thing. It's a word and a tagline and the experiences and emotions we hold around that. But businesses are complex. If you've got multiple branches and multiple service providers and complex supply chains and multiple touch points and all of these different things that you're having to control, it becomes immeasurably more difficult to predict where one of those might. Like, I mean, nobody could have. I mean, maybe they could have, and possibly it would. You know, it's a devastating oversight on the part of Click stakeholders. But the point is that I think many of those kinds of incidents and oversights go unrecognized and unchecked on a monthly basis, and often the ones that get recognized is it's just a perfect storm of timing and so on and so forth. I think what we've learned through that, though, because I mean, the clients that I've often met with have gone, yeah, but like, you know. I'm like, you chose this. Your complexity is not my problem. As a customer, I didn't tell you to have 8 million customers. That was your choice. You went and got that many people and that many branches. This is a byproduct of your success, and you need to acknowledge and take responsibility of that complexity. That's not something that anybody forced on you. The market didn't oblige you to be that convoluted, right? And I think the battle that most brands have when it comes to crises is just avoiding making their complexity their customer's problem.
Could it have been dealt better?
I mean, it certainly appeared that way from the outside. And again, I'm always reticent to criticize a situation that I don't have enough insight into. I don't know what the moving parts were internally. I do know that, you know, sometimes how something is manifests as a crisis in a business might manifest very differently in social media.
Yes.
Sometimes in social media, situations or content or quotes or whatever can be taken as an isolated incident without necessarily having. But it looked to me like Clicks panicked in that moment, and their panic manifested in terms of a delay. And as Victor said, you know,
that first message as well. You know, you touched on that first message that was sent out.
Yeah, we're sorry you're offended. The classic, this is obviously about you and not about us.
Yeah.
You just can't afford to.
But guys, you know, we live in a country where there's, you know, lots of cultural diversity, and a lot of these crises sometimes come from, you know, people who don't understand that cultural diversity that we have. And then it gets politicized, which makes the crisis even worse. You know, I mean, the Clicks crisis with the EFF getting involved. But we've seen, you know, it turns quite nasty when politics get involved as well.
Well, I think, Aki, you know, the personal is always political. And if you think about the most recent case where you had one of the South African fashion institutes putting together a kind of competition with an oversight body that did not include one black South African. You know, you're just kind of saying, but I mean, what's going on? This is 2021.
Exactly.
So I think that diversity is definitely one of the things that South African companies have done very badly at. So the Clicks problem, people said, who is in the room? You know, who was in the room when these decisions were made? So ideas about who is beautiful, ideas about who is trustworthy, ideas about who to advertise in a car. We are surprisingly still using ideas that we used 20 years ago.
Sure.
So if you think about it, that's often the real lag that the decision makers often imagine themselves to be talking to their own audience, whereas the stakeholders are much more complex. You know, so if you have a company in South Africa that still has 12 white men as on its board, it's unlikely that it will make decisions that reflect the real South Africa. And I do think that just magnifies the crisis. But also, you get a sense sometimes that companies do not understand that people are deeply invested. One, for example, I know that you are an Aston Villa fan,
Hey.
and an Orlando Pirates supporter. In fact,
GPs, you've been very loud over the last while.
so
Listen, I got a
Times are
reason to
good.
be-
Times are
yeah.
good.
So what happens is that imagine the guys at Aston Villa who are out there. They, which is one thing that's really interesting about English football, is that the guys at Man U, at Arsenal, at Spurs, the great Spurs men here.
Yes, I didn't want to say anything.
So they understand that their supporters are in England, that their supporters are in Asia, that
yes.
they are in Nigeria, they're in South Africa. So they behave accordingly. In fact, you can see a lot of their hires when they pick, they are very deliberate in making the team look like their fan base. And I think South African companies could learn a great deal from that, because it then changes the tonality of your of your communications. If you look, for example, at even BBC, they've got a pidgin, Niger pidgin, as one of the languages that they do. So sometimes I'm surprised that South African companies have not got that. If you look at a company like Nando's, for example, the extent to which it steps outside of the lived reality of its marketers, and it starts saying, what is this South Africa and what does it look like? And if you look at whether someone like Sibongile Khumalo, when she died, and they just say, thank you, Ma, and they don't even have to put in the Nando's logo, because it's them just from the font
powerful.
and the tonality. So there are many examples that show what happens when a company becomes more uniquely South African. And I think our word of advice would be really be more immersed in the culture, because it just means that you hear finer, you see better, and you are less of an outsider. And then complexity is not a curse, it's actually a blessing.
Are people more forgiving if you get those things right?
Well, I think certainly your crises are contextualized better, if that. So I mean, this is not always the case, but often
sure. It
people are
depends on
willing
the
to look
crisis,
at your
yeah.
track record. But I think there's a point to be made here around malice. I think this is an important word as it relates to crisis, because very few brand crises can be tracked back to the malicious and decisive intent of a toxic element in the organization. Often we're talking about stupidity or ignorance or over, and so I think that's important because two reasons. Number one, admitting that is extremely powerful. We completely overlook this. This is a blind spot for our organization, and here's what we're going to do to fix it. That's a really powerful way of expressing
Sure.
that you made a mistake. You acknowledge that it was a mistake, and you're not going to repeat it. As Victor said, if you repeat the same mistake 3 months in a row, not a mistake anymore. Now it's intentional.
Right.
But the other side that's important to realize is it doesn't matter to the audience.
Yeah, they don't care.
Yeah, it's not really important to the social media audience whether you intended to or didn't, whether you were ignorant or not. It is going to be perceived as malicious and intentional 99 times out of 100.
That's a good point.
And one must calibrate one's response according to that. One must understand that that's how it's going to be perceived and respond accordingly. Again, I'm going to make the point that nobody held a gun to any brand's head and said you had to be in Twitter or Facebook.
No, exactly.
You're there by choice. You're electively in that space. You are a guest. And we must remember that that's part of the price that we pay for this incredibly interactive and intimate and exponentially powerful space is you're going to pay the price of that increased risk.
Now, just talking about risk, guys, we're living in 2021, and you look at that. They said data is the new oil that we have, and you have these massive organizations who are the custodians of our personal information, whether it be a bank, whether it be Facebook, whether it be Twitter. When you hear of a data breach or a cybersecurity threat or something goes horribly wrong, and your personal information goes out into the public domain by hackers who want to really be malicious, to your point, are cyber threats as a crisis going to evolve to be one of the kind of major amplification points when there's a massive crisis in the world that we're living in today? or is it going to be as big as a crisis as the clicks crisis, for example? I mean, how do you define that? Because I think going forward, when you look at the data and the backdrop of cyber threats that we have in the world today, and just recently we had this one of the big credit organizations, losing millions of records of data. Is that going to be a big thing going forward?
So my son, who is 22, when I was talking to him, I was like, "Oh, I see you haven't joined Signal or Telegraph." He's like, "Dad, Facebook already have your data." And he was like, we willingly give up our data. If you look at how you join social media, the permissions that you give and all that. So I think in many ways we perform outrage around our data, and yet in many ways we give up a significant amount of our data. If you look at the most addicted of social media users, we know exactly where they live, because they tell us. We know who their kids are. We know where those kids go to school. We know their favorite restaurant and all that.
You sound like one of these guys in the movies. We know where you live.
Well,
but it's true.
Yeah, but they do. So they do give it up willingly. They are, of course, I think, if once you start doing the more serious things, like banking, your policies, your travel, and all that, security then becomes very, very important, because there you are talking about your assets, and what they are. And I think increasingly the sophistication of cybercrime and the attacks show how valuable that information is.
Yes.
And I think we can only expect that it's going to get worse. If you look at if I look, for example, at the extent to which my bank, before it was just a password, now the layers, and then they've even got rid of the OTP because they know it can be diverted. So I do think that going forward, Mike and I will be dealing with social media crises that are really as a result of
data breaches.
Data breaches, and I think a lot of organizations are still behaving as if we are not in that kind of age. So for me, I do expect that it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
At the personal level, I think sometimes people are more optimistic about the value of their data. So you will remember, for example, when Instagram said they could use your photo, and people were like, and we're thinking, but nobody will want to use your photos because they are so awful, So sometimes it's the idea of someone abusing our information that scares us more than its reality.
Yeah, I think if any of us had a really clear idea of how much of our data is actually already out there in the relatively public domain, or certainly accessible to even the most basic,
scary,
we would be quite scared. But I think the point is again around promise. If you're promising to protect my data, if you're promising to have my best interests at heart, and you deliver anything differently, that's where my disappointment is going to come in. It is a trend that is ticking upwards. So I think we will see more and more of that. But again, on any given day, as you've realized, it can be any brand faced with any circumstance. And I guess that's why we like being the Ghostbusters of the space.
Well, listen, I'm glad you touched on the social media and WhatsApp, for example, and what these organizations know. And you look at, how massive, the likes of Amazon and Google and Facebook have become, and how much they know about us. I mean, the recent, crises that Facebook had with WhatsApp, to say that if you don't do this by the 5th of February, we're going to block you off. And you saw this massive growth in Telegram, for example, and what's the other one? Signal. So let me ask you guys. I mean, if you walk the talk, are you guys still on WhatsApp and Facebook? Are you of the opinion that social media knows too much about me and I need to disconnect from the rest of the world? Or are the other guys doing the same thing, like Signal and Telegram, for example? Are you both on WhatsApp?
Well, I'm definitely on WhatsApp. I signed for Signal, but it keeps on asking me for a password, and I just deleted the thing. You know, I'm
Damn safety measure.
I'm on Telegram, and you know.
Do you
but
feel safer?
I think it's okay. I don't understand it enough, because it's possible that, you know, we jumped because it's almost like being disappointed with your supermarket, and you go to the next one next door, and for the first 3 months it seems okay until you have the same experience. So my sense is that the social media companies at some point want to monetize your data, and they do. They want to monetize your activity. If you look at, for example, the change in how you could, if you look at the change, for example, in Instagram, how it was based on who you follow, and now it's the algorithm, and very often you see stuff like, but why am I seeing this person and all that?
Yes.
So it's changed from something that I think was one-on-one. It's now an ecosystem that promotes shopping, it promotes broadcasting. It's become much more complex.
And you're okay with that?
I don't use it anymore.
Oh,
You know,
okay.
it just overwhelmed me.
What, Facebook and that?
Facebook I haven't used for a long time. I am just there. I still have my account so that I can read, because obviously the only way you can advise people is if you experience it. So I personally don't post anything anymore. But I think if you also look, Aki, at the growth of something, say like Clubhouse,
Yes.
it just shows you that if there's one thing we can be certain, is that there will always be innovation. Because when TikTok came, we're like, what's this? If you look at how quickly it reached maturity relative to, say, Facebook and Twitter, before you could say TikTok, it was already,
It was already
talking, yeah. And I think we're seeing the same thing with Clubhouse, where you see some of the users are already on 10 million users. You're like,
No, exactly.
yeah, like when? So the speed of change is also, I think, part of this complexity where, you know, and I think the instinct of many users to say there's just too many of these platforms. And I think that part of our advice is get on as early as possible, because if you understand the native stage, when it's being set up and it changes, you know, they people who've joined Twitter now understand it differently from those who've joined in 2015 or 2010. So I'm already on Clubhouse. I eavesdrop into many rooms, I join all that, so that by the time my clients say, I've got this crisis,
You know what you're talking about.
I know what I'm talking about.
It's interesting. Are you like threatened by social media? Do you think that the likes of Facebook have taken it too far?
I can't take an ideological stance on this. Okay, it would be fundamentally hypocritical of me to do so. I ran a social media business for 15 years.
Yes,
right? I can't
yes.
now take an ideological
No, fair
stance and
enough,
say
fair
these things are bad. I'm also well aware that, again, and I'm going to say this again, nobody forced me to be there.
Yes.
Nobody said you have to be in Facebook. I benefited from that platform in many ways for many years, commercially, personally, whatever it might be. Here's what I think. I think if you have an email address, privacy is already a misnomer. Right?
Yes.
So I think we get far too precious about this ourselves, and maybe we need to reevaluate our own sense of importance and our own responsibility in terms of our personal data. My decisions to be on or off something are not ideological, they are practical. Like if the utility disappears, which I found it did do on Facebook, the most useful feature on Facebook was the birthdays feature. I figured out how to export the birthdays. They're in my calendar now, and I no longer use Facebook.
Did he wish you a happy birthday?
My birthday is usually on the 5th of March.
It's still
Well, good,
coming
it
up.
hasn't
Did he
changed,
wish
okay.
you last year?
Probably
Well,
not.
Probably not, but
It's not my strength. It's not my strength.
No. But it's.
I have other strengths.
The birthday-
I smell an oncoming crisis.
But the birthday thing is so true, though. Yeah,
But that's it. That's the
yeah,
only
yeah.
benefit for me, right?
Yeah.
So that was a utility thing. Although I did write a little bit about this because I felt like quitting Facebook was, and this is going to be very, very melodramatic and kind of pathetic, but it was a bit like losing an old friend. Like my whole professional life has been built around the existence of that
Yes.
platform.
No,
I
I hear you.
owe it a lot. But it just felt like it was a friendship that got really toxic
Yeah.
and really unpleasant. And I was like, well, this just kind of sucks now.
Yeah.
So that was my reasoning, but it's very practical. It's not
Yeah.
ideological at all.
But-
I think we can't take an ideological.
But I guess when
stance
you
these
look at
days.
the European Union and you look at the perception that they have of these social media platforms, they're saying you guys have become too big. You need to break up, and it's coming in the US as well. There's all sorts of hearings, etc. So I think they are going to be scrutinized even more, going forward. But coming back to 48 hours, with the advent of fake news and deep fakes, for example, it's crazy. I mean, there's a video that's circulating YouTube where you see Obama and somebody's taken this video, taken his voice, and it sounds like Obama saying something, and it's Obama, but it's actually not Obama. Now, the reputational damage that these things can do to an organization without the organization having to do anything is quite dangerous. So deep fakes, fake news, for example, I mean, I'm sure that's big on your radar as well.
Well, I think if you look at deepfakes, it just shows you how far and how quickly the technology has developed.
Yes.
I mean, and also how quickly these representations of humans can be created. It's largely been automated. Before, it would have taken a Hollywood studio a great deal of investment to create something as believable as that. But also a lot of the skills are now automated. So, and I think that's what creates fake news. Before, you had to have reasonable Photoshop skills to create something that was believable. Now it's largely automated, and I think that organizations, as Mike says, need to panic less and be more thoughtful. If that means that they come to us and say, look, we have what looks like the beginning of a crisis, we can help them do that, because certainly when people see something, and we've seen it with the extent to which those videos get shared.
Yes.
People believe first without even reverse clicking. So that's why also, as much as we have the growth of fake news, we also have growth in the fact-checking industry. The fact-checking industry is a reminder of the kind of threats that the transition to digital has created.
That's such a good point. And you just look at right now, what's happening with the vaccines, for example, how social media, in particular Facebook, is countering the spreading of fake news about vaccines, for example. But, the deep fakes scare the living daylight out of me.
I'm excited about them, Aki. I'm super excited. I'm excited about any AI that creates content for one reason and one reason only. If that is possible, hopefully it starts making people say or think, I can't believe anything I see. Okay. At face value, yes. Right? I can't believe anything I see at face value, so I must ask deeper questions about it. I must do some research. I must ask around, or whatever it might be. If that's what deepfakes do to society, which is basically the opposite of what social media has done to society, where it said, if it's on the internet, it must be true. Like if it's published, it must be true. Because if we think about the generation, kind of our folks before us and our generation, we were conditioned to believe that if it's on television, it's true.
Yes.
If it's in the newspaper, it's true, right? That's what we were the production pain that took to get that thing onto that medium meant that the effort that it took normally edified its quality, right? What we've realized is that all of these things are easy to do now, so that the quality must be dodgy. So hopefully we question all of it. Do you like our business card?
I love this business card.
Huh?
Can we just zoom in on this business card? Because I think this business card is so cool. So once you flip it up, you'll see, and it goes like that, and you'll see that there's Mike's details that pop up. And if you look at the back of the business card, there's also, it's an 8, right?
It's an hourglass. Yeah.
It's an hourglass.
So the time is running out. Yeah.
Time's running out. And then if you pop it further down and you click it from the bottom, you'll see Victor's name pop up, which is really, really genius. Guys, I have enjoyed talking to you so much. I could talk to you for hours because it's such a relevant topic. But coming back to what 48 hours is all about, what advice do you give organizations? What advice can you give them right now? An organization that, say, faces a crisis, but they think that it's small enough for them to handle internally, not realizing how social media can amplify something and really it does spiral out of control. We've seen this so many times. So, what is the advice that you can give? In three pieces of advice that you can give to a company when they are hit with a crisis.
Well, I think Mike Stopforth, think Victor Dlamini, and think 48 hours.
Just like that.
In those three steps.
In those three, I love the way you sell yourself, but it's true, call in the pros, just coming back to that, a lot of people think they can handle something like that on their own. It doesn't quite work like that.
People don't cut their own grass anymore. They've got lawnmower experts. How do you think you can deal with the crisis? Come to us.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's maybe two things though, and obviously I want to support and amplify what Victor said because he's extremely good at it. But I think number one is prevention is always better than cure. Rather anticipate the worst case scenario, and what's it? Plan for the worst, hope for the best, right?
Yes.
But I think that's got to apply in this space. And then certainly, and this is I think the golden thread that's run through all of this. There's nothing more profoundly effective in a crisis than a sincere apology. But the emphasis is not on apology, it's on sincere. That's really hard to do because you have to back it up. It's not marketing, it's values. But yeah, I just to the guys that are listening out there, I sincerely hope we never have to work with you. And Ux, just thanks so much for having us on the show.
I just think
what a
thought
privilege.
of one thing now. I mean, so do you guys do crisis management and do you do damage control as well? Or was there two separate things?
Well, I think crisis management, it essentially we allow you to recover from the crisis intact, so that you can focus on your business. So part of our value is that instead of a CEO in a moment of crisis focusing exclusively on that crisis, we bring in a fresh set of eyes, good ears, as well as the ability to help them navigate in a much surer way than they would if they were on their own. Because the real crisis, they can divert executive attention to the point where not only are you addressing that crisis, but you are neglecting your actual delivery of a service or a product.
Fantastic, guys. 48h.co.za is the website, 48h.co.za. Mike Stopforth, Victor Dlamini. Guys, it's been such a privilege to catch up with you again. I love the idea of your social media crisis consultancy, and sounds like you guys are onto something. It's you really need to have this kind of service in the complex world that we're living in social media, where one voice can amplify and really cause so much destruction and brand damage in a short space of time, that you need the services of you guys to help you get through that crisis. So thank you for your time.
Aki, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.